Hi YouTubes, today I'm going to be doing some upgrades on the Datsun 510. I just ordered a set of coilover, full coilover suspension from a company called Silver Mine Motorsports. I've heard good reviews from them, but I have yet to see anybody running them on a Datsun 510, so I'm going to be trying them out. My current suspension is kind of a mix of things. The front end is all T3 stuff with their front coilover kit. I believe it has 5K springs. The rear is still kind of an old school setup using specialty engineering parts. It has springs, shortened springs in the back, and then it's just running regular KYB shocks in the back. I really don't have any specs on that. It's probably about an 850 or 900 pound spring in the rear, and then the shocks are just a standard KYB Camaro style that a lot of the Datsun 510 guys run. So I'll be setting it up today and installing it. It's both height adjustable and spring perch adjustable. So I'll be showing you some of those things and how specifically it goes into my car. My car is a little bit different than some of yours, so your mileage may vary or whatever the saying is. So I'll kind of walk you through it and we'll kind of be exploring this together. First, we'll just kind of do an overview of what we have here. Again, this is the rear coilover right here. So the coil is up here, top hat, and the mounting mechanism up here on the top. This is for your coil preload and set. The bottom section here, this is what's So quickly, we'll just do a small overview of what we have here. Again, this is the coil itself for a coilover system. The shock is integrated into here. The bottom section is what makes it a little bit more interesting. So the mounting mechanism that they use is one of these kind of modular setups. And this is the reason I went with this set, is because it is height adjustable, not just spring adjustable, like T3's stuff. A lot of companies seem to be going with this mechanism, so even if I decide that I don't like the way Silver Mine has set these up, I assume that this mounting mechanism is fairly common amongst other companies, such as Fortunato, BC Racing, some of those other companies that use this kind of modular setup for coilovers. So this is what I'm going with. The first thing I'm going to do for the rear is actually set this up to be about the correct height for the shock that I have. So this is the current shock that I have. This is just a KYB gas adjust, nothing special. What I'm looking at here is the full droop of this shock. I'm just going to kind of set it up, kind of eyeball it to be about the same height. Looks like out of the box, that's about where it's set for me. What I'm really looking at here is where this mounting mechanism goes, because this is the part that actually locks down and mounts into the car. So that's really where I'm looking at, is where these 2 points are at. The top is a little bit less important. So that apparently is about where it needs to be, so I don't need to adjust this. Otherwise you would adjust this sleeve down. This is the locking nut for this sleeve. So the next thing I'm looking at is making sure that the spring is loaded just a little bit. It's going to have zero load on it. This is mostly just to kind of keep the spring in place and keep it from rattling around. So once you get it up into here, you'll see right there, once I get it to a certain spot, the spring itself turns. So that lets me know that it's basically at zero preload. Then I'm going to take the locking nut and just kind of put it into place. I'm not going to tighten these down right now, because once I get it into the car, I need to actually determine if it's at the correct ride height and where I need it to be. So I'll do that at a later time. I did take measurements ahead of time, as well as you should, to determine where you want on your current suspension, at the very least to get it to an alignment shop. So if your car is already in alignment, I would highly suggest that you just set it to where your car currently is, get it to the alignment shop, and let them do all the messing around with these things. Obviously, you should take it to a reputable alignment shop. Let's do this. Obviously, you should take your suspension to a reputable alignment shop, simply because even on this shock itself, there's so many points of adjustment, dealing with preload and dealing with height adjustment. From there, any of your other adjustments that you have. In the rear of my car, I do have Byron's rear control arm adjustment that I bought from Fudo Fab. They're an excellent unit, and they do allow for quite a bit of adjustment of both toe and camber in the rear. Without that, you're just kind of stuck with whatever the alignment is on your rear control arm, and you only have height and spring adjustment from this right here. So if that's your style, you just want to go for height and spring adjustment, go for it. I'm looking for quite a bit more. I will be running this through its paces on autocross and hopefully some road courses this year, and see how it performs. One last note that I did want to point out here, I don't know how accurate this is, but on this spring, it does have a number written right here. And in case you can't read that on there, it says 8K 180. I kind of assumed that's the spring rate that's on here, and probably its height, so it's probably a 180 millimeter spring with an 8K spring tension. If that's incorrect, I will update it, but I believe that's what it is. I will double check with Silver Mine and find out if that's the true specs for it. Obviously, if you're doing a performance suspension, you should know your spring rates. The rears here are not, they're not compression or rebound adjustable. The fronts do have an adjustment on there, and I'll be going over that when I talk about the fronts. So step number one here is to remove this lower shock mount. This just locates it on the shock mount itself. I like to remove this one first, so that when I release the one from the top up there, I'm not fighting the shock moving up and down while trying to remove this. So this is the first one I'm going to remove right here. By the way, these ratcheting wrenches, super awesome. You should probably get a set for yourself. These are just cheap Harbor Freight ones, but they still work pretty well for the amount of work that I do and the type of work that I do. So get yourself a set. So as you can see, it's just a spring, or excuse me, it's just a bolt and a washer that hold it in here and hold it onto the mount. So this is where my car starts to vary considerably from everybody else's setup. So in the rear here, I actually have Z31 hubs welded in right here, so that I can run Z31 CV axles. So this is Z31 axle and the, Z31 CV joint, both on the inside and outside, so I can run my R200. But the axle is from an early 90s Pathfinder, I believe it's called the D21. So this is my particular setup, and this is how it differs. Obviously, if you have a standard 510, you're going to be removing a U-joint axle from the rear right here, just to give yourself enough droop so that we can let out the lower control arm and get the spring out. That doesn't look good either. Good thing I'm replacing these axles at some point. So that just needs to come loose right there so that this can droop down far enough in order to let the top shock out and get the lower spring out. So this is what the top of the shock mounts right here. This is just a single nut on top of the shock body itself. If you have a lot of corrosion up here, you may need to actually hold on to the shock right there. There is a little flat on it, so you can do that. Mine have been in and out a few times, and there's no corrosion, so no issues removing it. Pretty simple. As you tighten these down, what you're kind of shooting for is this rubber part right here should squish to be about the same diameter as the washer that's on top there. And the same will hold true for our new suspension, even though it's using a poly bushing up top instead of rubber. The same kind of idea holds true. Again, ratcheting wrench to the rescue. Depending on how much tension is on your suspension right now, when this lets go, it could let your bottom shock loose, so you might want to actually put a jack underneath the control arm. So I'm going to do that right now. So I'm going to put this jack underneath the control arm right here, so I can let it down at my own rate, so that the shock right here, when it lets go, it doesn't just drop the whole suspension. It is quite heavy and there's lots of moving parts, so you probably don't want that to happen. So you can see after putting the jack underneath it, this has been raised up a little bit. Makes it easier to take the nut off. And this right here, now this is loose. The new suspension does come with a nice little sleeve right here that tightens up that hole. And I'll show you that when we get there. So now it's time to take off the shock right here. You may need to get a pry bar in here and kind of pry this out. Again, mine's been out a number of times and it's fairly new with no corrosion, so no problem. Shock out. The next step is I'm going to let this jack down right here, this floor jack down, so that the suspension arm can droop enough to let the spring out.
Dollar for dollar, with no limit on how much you can earn. Extra cash. Come on, how amazing is that? In fact,
let it down fairly slowly, just so things don't just pop and bang and rip. Nothing's really under tension or anything, but obviously there are heavy parts under here that you need to be aware of. So move this out of the way. And again, depending on your suspension, depends on how much that's going to need to droop. The stock springs are much longer than the ones that I had in there, so you may need to droop it even further, but that's how far mine needed to go. So now it's basically time for reinstallation. I'm going to raise this arm up just a little bit in order to get my axle back on, and that should get me close to where things need to be lined up in order to put my shock in. So before I go and install the bottom section here, and I discovered that I need to put the bottom on first, I did want to point out the top before I stick it on there. So this is the bushing that they use. So this piece right here will face down towards the bottom of my shock. And then this is the little sleeve I was talking about that helps to locate the upper shock area and keep things from kind of rattling around. It has a little bit better location than the stock system. So goes on the top right there. Kind of get this set up a little bit towards the top, but most of it is down here in the bottom. Using something soft because I don't want to damage it. Get that on there. You can see obviously it's still loose up top. We will locate that in just a moment. For now, bolt and washer. And just have it hand tight for now. We'll tighten it later once we figure out what the position is. Even though this doesn't have any preload or anything on this bushing down here, I still think it's a good idea to keep this loose for a minute. So the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to raise this up and I'll show you the top view as the top of the shock starts to come through. So here's where it's going to come through at. Just going to kind of locate it with my hand down here. Raise the jack up. This does take a little bit of coordination and maybe a friend, but it can obviously be accomplished by yourself. So now that it's coming through, still needs to be centered a little bit. There we go. Alright, so that's what we're looking for here. This sleeve, again, that kind of locates a little bit better in here. You can see how much tighter it is in that space. And right now there's a little bit of pressure coming up from the bottom to make sure everything is kind of seated. Top bushing. Apparently needs to be hammered down just a little. There we go. Alright, washer. And this is a nylock washer, so you shouldn't have to worry about putting a lock washer or anything else on here. And as I thread it on, it is a 19 millimeter, which is quite a bit larger than the standard 14 millimeter. Unfortunately, I do not have a ratcheting wrench that is 19 millimeter. There is an Allen hole up here, which you probably don't need to mess with, but just in case you need to tighten it a little bit more or keep the shock from spinning, it is there. So I'm just going to tighten this down until this washer right here actually contacts that metal sleeve, which tells me that it is bottomed out. So the suspension itself is not using these poly bushings as a suspension piece. It is not putting any force on there. Those are simply there to help kind of keep down some vibration. What's actually holding it is that sleeve to the shock to this washer right here, and that's where the pressure is being put at. So you don't need to worry about something like this being a dampened spring inside of here. So if that's one of your concerns, or if that's something that happens in another suspension, be aware of it. Here it is right there. And it stopped. So as you can see, I really didn't need to put any pressure on this Allen head right here. That's just in case maybe there's a little bit of friction or something on that thread, and that your shock body might spin, so I didn't need it. And there it is. Now, obviously with any setup, you should probably have one and, two of them installed. So of course I did the passenger side first to practice, as you all should if you're trying to make a video of some kind showing people how to do stuff. Learn on the first one, show us on the second one. Just as you should take measurements. So I measured from that seam right underneath where the door is to my fender, and I got a measurement of 21.5 inches. So that way when I put this back together, I'll at least be kind of close to what my previous suspension settings were, so that when I take it to the alignment shop, they can get it dialed in. So time for reassembly. Just to go over what my setup currently is, these are TSW Kylamis, or however you say them. They're 16x7. I believe this is a plus 38 offset. I'm running Potenza RE71s. This is a 205 45/16. This is about as sticky a tire as I can get under this car right now, and only on a 7-inch wheel. 205 is not a whole lot of rubber. I still spin quite a bit. You might see a video up of me spinning in third gear on the highway. Heads up. To make it kind of fit in here a little bit better, I do have, this is a 12 millimeter spacer. It is hub centric. I highly recommend this. I had some cheap 10 mil spacers that were just a cast piece and they were junk, but they did the job to kind of locate things. I do have ARP longer wheel studs, which is going to be required for almost everybody's setup running a modern wheel of some kind, so keep that in mind. And based on experience, this little Ryobi impact gun, this is the 1/2 inch size. This is good for about 80 pound-feet of torque with that many Ooga-Doogas on there, so keep that in mind. Just checking real quick, I already put a hand back here, but I'm looking to see if there's any interference between my new shocks and my wheels. I still have quite a bit of space, but depending once again on your setup and how much space you have, you should definitely take that into consideration. Usually springs need a little bit of time to kind of settle in, but let's see where our measurement is right now. Yeah, we're over an inch higher than we need to be, so this is where we needed to be. And we are at about 22 3/4. Again, I measured from this point right here. So that means I need to let the shock body down. That's one of the great things about this is I don't need to mess with spring preload at all. I just need to let the shock itself down. So I'm going to go measure the other side, and if it's about the same, then I know I need to let it down about the same. Okay, so in order to bring this up, I need to loosen this lock nut right here, which feels like there's a little bit of pressure on. But first you should probably measure and decide how far it's going to go. So hopefully you can see right there, I used a little paint marker and made a little mark. I decided to go with about an inch lower, so that'll get me within reason and a little bit of spring sag, or excuse me, a spring settling after I put some miles on it, so get me close to where I need to be. So come with these wrenches, as everybody's probably seen. Of course, 2 sets, one for small, this one's small, these 2 are large. So let's loosen this up. There we go. So loosen that up, but I'm going to keep these ones tight. The reason for that is this is where I need to actually bring the body down. So what I'm going to do is these are locked together, not very tightly, so I'm going to lock these 2 together a little bit more. And then I'm going to take this one and I'm going to start winding it down so that I can get this closer to this measurement here. So what's happening is this will then wind down into here because these 2 are locked together. So it should provide pressure on the body itself to wind down into the lower part. Should be locked together now. And now, as I start to twist this body is now threading down, and this will take some time. So I'll stop the video here because you don't want to watch this. One thing I did forget to mention, I do have a floor jack here underneath on the control arm with some pressure up, again because I'm shortening the shock body. That means my suspension is kind of compressing up. So to kind of keep a little bit of pressure on this so that I'm not trying to lift a control arm with these wrenches. So make sure you have something underneath there so that you can actually put this up within reason. Okay, so it took me a few minutes to get there. It's about where I want it to be. Again, this is best guess. The alignment shop will fix it as they should. So once you get it to where you need it to be, I'm going to go ahead and lock this down, which is locking this collar against here to prevent the body itself from turning. There we go. So that should be about where it needs to be. I'll lower it down and check it again. It's about almost an inch too high over here, but I think that's, or excuse me, a ½ inch too high over here. But I think that's probably acceptable, at least to get to the alignment shop. It's exactly the same on the other side, so I'm going to call that a win. Okay, so in order to remove the front struts, the first thing you want to do is remove your caliper. In my instance, I have a 2-piston caliper from a Z31 300ZX or a J30 or anything around from the early 90s from Infiniti and Nissan. Mine, right here, there are 2 19mm bolts holding it on. I do put a little bit of Loctite on there. That's what was kind of keeping it from coming off by hand. Now, obviously, you don't want your caliper just flopping around and hanging by the brake line here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it over here. A couple of zip ties. I'm going to zip tie it here to my sway bar because the sway bar does not need to come off. Next thing, and this is very difficult to show, There are two 19mm bolts here holding the strut to the steering arm, or the steering knuckle, whatever you want to call it. Mine are 19mm, stock is 17. These are 19mm because I have these red spacers on here. These are bump steer spacers, or whatever you want to call them. These ones are from Techno Toy Tuning. They're on here pretty well because they do need to hold your steering to your suspension. So work them down nice and tight. There is a lock washer on there, and then I throw a little tiny bit of blue Loctite on there just for extra added insurance, because I did have one of them come loose once. So now comes the part that's going to be difficult to show on camera. So I'm going to loosen this 19mm top nut here that's on my strut. Sounds like it might be spinning the shaft there, so I'm going to have to go under and grab it. But once I let that loose, it's going to allow the suspension to droop, and then I can pull it out from the other side. So I can't show both sides at the same time, so you're only going to get one view. So there's that top nut loose. This little part right here actually goes into the camber plate bearing itself, and obviously to tighten it down. Techno Toy Tuning does have some spacers and things depending on what your suspension setup is. Mine are stock 240 or S30 shocks, so this is what I needed, no spacers. And drop it out. There we go. Techno Toy Tuning coilovers, and here is their bump steer spacer. Alright, so I'm going to remove the T3 camber plates. One thing that I don't like about these is that this is just a bolt, so I actually have to reach from underneath here. So here I am down here. I have to reach from underneath with a socket and put it on the bolt to remove these. Now I am using an impact on these just to break them loose, just because it's faster, but do not use an impact on the nut that goes in here. That's a note from Techno Toy Tuning. They said it's basically guaranteed to foul this up and mess up your bearing in here, so don't use it on that. Each one of these slots right here actually has a little bit of caster into it. Not a whole lot. You might get 1 degree or something out of it, but on a Datsun 510, every little bit of caster helps, and basically it's free camber gain as you... Okay, so here's my struts with the Techno Toy Tuning setup. Here's their top hat that they supply. There's a bearing in here. I believe they call that a thrust bearing or needle bearing. A little bit dusty from actually being used. I'll clean those up later. I still have my bump steer spacer, or bump stop, sorry. Still have my bump stop from the setup that I had from Specialty Engineering. So, or actually, let me rephrase that. I got this from Top End Performance. I got this with an old, kind of an old school camber plate setup that they had. I believe they use Hyperco coils. So here's the setup that they have. These it says 188 B0275, so I believe these are 275 pound springs. Probably 188 is the length here. It sits down on this aluminum hat here, on this threaded body, and then you have to weld on this little piece right here. So in order to get this back off, I'm actually going to have to remove this nut right here. This is kind of a standard size nut on Datsun parts. It's not on too tight unless it's been seized on for some reason. I threw a little bit of anti-seize on there, so one little quick twist and it's already loose. That comes off. So this can come off now, but I'm actually going to pull the strut out so you can see it. So this is the strut I've been running basically since I've had the car, so it has about 16,000 miles on it. Again, this is basically just a stock S30 unit. In order to get it to fit into my strut housing and have this come down and thread into a reasonable amount, I actually did have to grind down the bottom of my strut housing here. So there still is a small lip right there, but I probably took, I don't know, 2 millimeters off of this so it would fit down inside of my particular strut tubes. So it is what it is. This unit here kind of slides off, pull it off, and it's actually held on with a little bit of tension from, well, what's left of these rubber band kind of things. So this one still has some life left in it. This other one, just like on my other strut, has basically just disintegrated. So I'm not terribly pleased about that setup. It seems to work just fine, but again, without those, you put this on here, you're going to notice there is some play in there. You'll see when I install the Silver Mine Motorsports stuff, it's a very tight fit. In fact, if you have too much paint on there, it either won't go on or it goes on very, very tough. So other than that, this is my strut. Again, this right here is an S12 200SX with a 5-lug hub, and then these are 300ZX slotted or vintage rotors, and I went with the 5-lug route because I thought there would be more wheel options for me. When I'm starting to look at wheels, it does seem a little bit bare. So just like on the back, I do have a 12mm spacer. These are hub-centric. I do highly recommend you get hub-centric units just so that they fit a little bit more snugly on there. Yes, it does twist that way, but it does not move up or down. So I recommend doing that. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull this whole hub off. First thing, like on most classic cars and stuff, you have these little bearing caps. Depending on how tightly yours is on there, depends on how difficult it's going to be to get off. So let's give it a twist and see what happens. So mine's going to be difficult. It's fighting me. You should probably do this on the car, but I wanted to pull the whole unit off so I could show you. I'm going to try and put this under the lip here and just kind of twist. Usually that works. There we go. Another thing you do have to be careful of on most of these covers is there's usually a rubber O-ring on here to help seal it and keep dust and stuff out, because that's obviously the purpose of these. Go. Put the big one under there. There we go. That's it. A little bit of grease in there. There's your little rubber O-ring. Helps keep crap out. Next up is this little clip. Actually, that's stupid. This is up next. Don't try and reuse these. They're cheap. Go and buy a pack of them. Trash. And that holds on this kind of castellated thing to help keep this nut from spinning. Again, this nut should not be on there very tight. There's just enough on there to keep enough preload on these bearings inside. So you should probably use the proper size wrench, but it shouldn't be too much trouble. There you go, to loosen it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen it most of the way. Let's take it all the way off first real quick. So I'm going to thread it back on just a little bit. This way I can kind of pull up on it and make sure that the bearings themselves aren't stuck. They're not. So now I'm going to take this, pull it off as one unit. There we go. And the whole thing's off. Now, since I have limited workspace, my bearing that's sitting over here, I'm actually going to cover it. Actually going to cover it with the dust cap, because I mean that's literally its job. So I'm going to cover it with that so that none of my shavings or anything get into my bearing. So I'm going to clean the old grease off of here. One of the main reasons I went with these struts over 280ZX units is the 300ZX units here, they have a different taper to the bearing, or they have a larger area here. I'm not quite sure what that is. I'll put some measurements up on the build thread for this. But because this is ever so slightly different than the 280ZX units, the 5-lug hubs don't quite fit on here. So using stock components, there are people who drill out hubs and stuff to make it 5-lug, but this is the route I went. So I'll post some measurements and stuff. I also have angles of all of these things so you can see if there's any difference between any of the other Nissan units. So these are going to be the specific measurements for this. I'm sure somebody will say, well, why are you going to clean those up if you're just going to put grease back on them, etc. The main reason is to check and see if there's any issues going on, if there's any uneven wear, any scoring, anything else happening here that you should be aware of. Again, these are used units with who knows how many miles on them, and then I myself have put 16,000 miles on them. So it's just a good maintenance kind of thing to check them out and see what's going on. Okay, so here's the Silver Mine units. Again, it's a threaded body with an adjustable shock, an adjustable spring up here. Unlike the backs, these fronts right here say 10K 180. Again, I'm assuming 180 millimeters, and this is a 10K spring. Camber plates on top. Unlike those T3 units, there is no caster adjustment. The good news is, though, if you can see from the back here, these are actually pressed in studs, so no two separate pieces to it. There is quite a bit of camber adjustment here. However, I do recommend that you actually clearance your upper strut housing in this area so you can actually access these things and move it. Right now, if you look closely, you can see in there, these are set to the two most outer points to get some more camber going in here because this is for the middle of the car. In order to get more camber than this little tiny bit right here, obviously you just want to move this up one hole so that you can actually move this. Again, hopefully you took measurements ahead of time so that you can put this about where it needs to go until you can get it to the alignment shop. Again, do lots of measurements. I took even more measurements because I'm trying to figure out what my kingpin inclination is and what all my cambers are for the 200 SX struts. So hopefully you took a bunch of measurements. So the way these work, this bottom portion here comes off. You can see there's quite a bit of thread on here. Still going, still going, still going, still going, still going, still going. There's a lot of strut here, okay? So that's about how far down it was threaded from the factory, almost all the way. So hopefully there's enough adjustment in my car. But this unit right here, what you're gonna do, you need to clean off this powder coat or paint that's on here. I believe this is just paint that's been baked on. So that you can get a good weld on it, because what you're going to do is you're actually going to weld this onto this strut tube. So their directions are to leave 2 or 3 inches. I'm going to use 2 inches of masking tape here to give myself a nice line to cut with. And that will give me plenty of meat to weld this down. One extra step I am going to take, the stock struts here, not that they have bad clearances or anything, but there is a little bit of variance between this and the strut tube. So I'm going to sink a little bit of weld in there just to give myself a little bit of peace of mind, because this will be the only time that I can actually reach that area. And then basically that goes on and away you go. Eyes, ears, hands. So I scraped off most of or sanded off most of the paint and stuff that's on here. It's time to clean it up and get it ready to weld. To clean and prep it, I'm using acetone. Acetone is usually recommended for welding and things. No residue, no smells, other than the initial smell. Good solvent. So clean up the welding surface. I'm going to clean it once. I'm actually going to hit it with some weld through primer up in this area, which is actually going to be underneath the flange itself. And as you can see, this goes on like this. You can see that there's enough on here that it's kind of friction fit until it goes down. There's no movement happening there. So first what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come in here, and if you look closely you can see there's the smallest little gap in there. So I'm going to fill that kind of with just a little bit of weld, sink it down in there. It will raise this up ever so slightly. I will make sure that it's flat and that this sits on here flat. There's really no other way for this to sit. It can't sit crooked or anything. But I just have a little bit more peace of mind sinking that in there. Obviously this will sit on top, and because of that second weld, I'll have a little bit more material to kind of sink something into, and then a couple of plug welds here on the holes. Okay, so I threw some weld through primer on here, and it's just one coat, nothing much, but you'll see that trying to put this back on, shit, made me into a liar. Alright, cut. So this is probably completely unnecessary, but I just assumed because of the mass that we have here, and this being a cast material, that this needs to be heated up in order for these things to fuse here with weld. So I'm going to heat it up a little bit here with the gas torch. It's about 250 degrees over here. It's only 210 on this side. 250, 240, 215. Yeah, like I said, this area here, because it's a heat sink, it's staying cooler, but it's still plenty warm in my opinion for what I want it to do. So I've set my welder up as recommended by the machine itself, and again I'm just putting a small bead down in here. I'm putting most of my heat into this section here because obviously that's the thickest part, and again I'm just trying to fuse these together a little bit better. It is welded from underneath from the factory, but this just makes sense to me. Well, I don't think I'm going to win any welding competitions here, but I think it looks alright for my standards. I think it'll hold the car together. Again, this is just extra peace of mind. It's really not even necessary, but now you can see as this starts to slide down, looks like it's expanded a little bit from heat. But as it slides down, it won't sit quite as flat as it did before. I will hit this a little bit with the flap wheel, but for the most part it's just going to sit on top of that weld, and then I'm going to sink in through this into that weld, which is then suck into that and that, and to me it gives it just a little bit more surface area in order to hold this on. Alright, so ground down the weld just a little bit. Make it a little bit flatter. Now, again, as I mentioned before, if you even put paint on here, this can be a little bit tight to get on. Soft flow handle here. So, the byproduct of also doing that is now, just this over here in frame, again, now there's kind of a groove in there that I can sink a weld into. and make sure that these two parts stay together. So that's where we're at. Alright, let's throw a weld in here and see what happens. Okay, so I went ahead and give this a quick couple coats of black paint. I used a high heat, like a engine enamel, just because again this is going to be in a high heat atmosphere with wheel bearings and brakes and those types of things. So I'll just get the tape off of here. I'm going to put tape on here, not just to mask off from the paint, but also to keep sparks or anything from coming in, messing with these machined surfaces. Getting dirt on there that I'm going to have to clean off later. Okay, now to assemble these, I'm going to put some of this Loctite. This is just copper-based anti-seize. Again, you just put it in here just to keep the surfaces from galling. These are both painted, and there shouldn't be any corrosion happening, but water can definitely get trapped inside of threads, as everybody with any type of threaded bolt or anything knows this happens. Again, there shouldn't be any moisture or anything getting in here, but it can happen. So to help prevent that, I'm just going to throw some on here. I'm going to put just a little bit in here, kind of on the lip. But most of this, I'm actually going to put on the threads. And you're going to think I'm putting too much on here, and I'm going up too high. But this is about how high the whole body's going to be threaded in there. So I'm starting here. So obviously I need to start getting anti-seize on there and make sure that there's enough. So I'm just going to throw it on here, not being too careful. This one's nice because it has a brush. I don't have to deal with a tube or anything like that. So just throw some on here. So as it starts to spin around, it gets a little bit on everything and keeps these from either galling or actually corroding it anyway. They are both steel, so there shouldn't be any electrolysis or any dissimilar metals happening there. That being said, these collars are made out of aluminum, and if you live in a corrosive environment, you definitely want to throw some anti-seize on there. I'll be throwing a little bit on there as soon as I get the setup just right, but that's where it goes. Now for the long, tedious part of actually threading this on here. Okay, here's where a little bit of guesstimate comes in. So when I measured the struts, I measured it from about the bottom of the mounting flange on the strut tops, so about the top of this to the center of the spindle. Again, that's just kind of a guesstimate measurement, and I came up with 21 1/8. And right now we are somewhere in that ballpark area. I think I might actually raise these up just a tiny little bit. Again, guessing here, I'm probably about 21 1/2. Okay, it's about time for reassembly. I've already installed the strut and the bump steer spacer, again 19mm, a little bit of blue Loctite on there just for, sanity. And douse this with some grease. Do not use an impact on this. This uses very, very little pressure. Or the blue tape that's from AM Fittings. This goes on, new cotter pin, cap goes over the top. There's a little bit of grease in there. Put a little extra in there. Good to go. So I found my first real gripe about this setup. These nuts on top, these are nice and big. They're much bigger than the 13 millimeter that T3 gives you. Unfortunately, these are not a metric size. This appears to be a 5/8. I'm sure that translates into like a 15 millimeter or something weird like that nobody ever has a wrench for. So unfortunately, that kind of sucks, which means if I ever want to take this apart at the track or something, I need to bring something that's non-metric on an otherwise Japanese car that has everything metric. Haven't checked the size on here. I have a sneaking suspicion that these are going to be a standard size as well, unfortunately, but what do you do? So one gripe isn't bad, but that's what we are so far. So I really like this Loctite gel that they make. I actually prefer the stick that it comes in. It's kind of like a little glue stick, but this is kind of neat. Give it a little twist. Throw some on there. Do it again. Throw some on there. And for those of you that like the liquid, you're like, oh, it doesn't spread nearly as well. I do this with my bolts regardless. Take and just kind of wrap them around each other. Spread it a little evenly. Keeps it from getting on my hands and spreads it a little better on the bolts. Now obviously before I stuck these in here, I kind of gave myself a rough measurement on height. Those were the measurements that I wrote up here on the side of my car. Obviously they're not in frame. But I wrote those down so that I had a rough measurement of how high the shock needed to be. Once everything is fully assembled, I will measure again. It's fairly easy to adjust this again, as I showed on, as you'll see on the back. You lock the two spring perch locking nuts together and then twist the body itself right here. Easy peasy. A little bit of blue Loctite on here. Again, they do have lock washers on them, but it's not like this is hurting anything. And blue Loctite is mostly just for vibration resistance. Oops, shit. Okay, so here's the final install. Went pretty smooth. The camber plates are almost maxed out, just to kind of reach the camber that I had previously. I'll check that out. I do have adjustable lower control arms to adjust for some of that, but as you can see, they're pretty well maxed out. The studs here are quite a bit longer than the T3 units. I might trim them down, but there doesn't seem to be any interference with the hood, so I don't see any issues coming from that. The final ride height still has to be determined, but for now it's about where it was previously, so there shouldn't be any issues there. And the back, again, I did raise it about a ½ inch from where it was. Just happened to be where the suspension landed, and I'm okay with that for now. So there it is. I'm going to take it for a quick test drive and see how it goes. When I say this is a bumpy road, but for the streets out here it's considered bumpy, so you'll probably notice the car bouncing around a little bit into the bumpy lanes. There's no squeaks or rattles or bangs or anything other than I do have a trunk release latch wire that bounces around a little bit, but no noises coming from the suspension. So normally after a fresh install you might get some squeaks or some bangs from things kind of settling in, and so far none of that. So far I would say that the lighter spring rate in the front, the Silver Mine has a 4K spring in front, and I moved over from the T3 unit that had a 5K spring. It does seem to be a little softer on compression, not so much so that it's bottoming out or anything. It just seems to soak up some of these smaller bumps a little bit better. Just seems a little smoother, I guess you'd say. Back end feels about the same. Again, the back end has 5K springs on it. Still don't have specs for the specialty engineering springs, but because of their location, the spring rate is obviously not equal. So their current position is about a 1-to-1 spring rate. So the 5K springs that are now in the back are about what you would see in the front. So I might move up to 5K springs in the front, but for now I'm going to leave with what Silver Mine put on here. Okay, so we'll call that a successful test drive. It seems to handle fairly normal. Again, I did notice a little bit softer front spring rate. That should be easily controllable either by switching out the front springs or turning the damper up a little bit. Again, right now it's set right in the middle at 18. For street driving, it seems pretty nice. The back end, didn't notice anything unusual, so we'll call that a win for now. So this week I am getting a tuned alignment on the car, more tuned towards performance driving on autocross and road course events, exactly where I want to be driving this car. Yes, it is still street driven. When it's a little bit nicer outside so I don't freeze, I will be driving it more on a daily basis. For now though, it's basically just my fun car. So once that's set up and dialed in, I'll give some feedback. Today is February 29th. And in just over a week, on March 8th, is the next road course event, or excuse me, the next autocross event, and during that event I'll be providing a little bit of feedback on how this performs. Until now, this is what we have. So until next time, go out there, have fun, be safe, do something with it, and work on it.